The 1960s was the time when society hit turbo mode, shifting gears from the 1950s nuclear family scene to the hippie, free-spirited scene by the end of the decade. You had Camelot in the White House with the Kennedys, and then tragedy struck. We put a man on the moon, fought for civil rights, and the whole world was on edge with the Cold War. Not to mention the Vietnam War, which cast a long shadow across America. And hey, speaking of shifting gears, science fiction movies were on their own roller coaster. They were busting out from the 50s horror mold, but still trying to find their own footing. And there were just two blockbusters that shaped science fiction that decade. I'm talking about Planet of the Apes and 2001: A Space Odyssey. But I'm not going to talk about either of those. I want to talk about the lesser-known science fiction movies of that decade because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And just like I've gone through the 70s and 80s, I've picked 10 lesser-known movies from that decade that left a mark on me. Then I went over to Rotten Tomatoes to see what the critics say and rank them by the tomatometer because it's fun. And as always, it's a surprise. So let's go ahead and start with the fun. Son of Godzilla dropped back in 1967 and got a 60 on the tomatometer from critics, but only a score of 30 from the audience. But hold the phone. Let me explain why this one is special to me. When I was a kid, I loved Godzilla movies. I'm Japanese American, if you didn't know that. And back then, there just wasn't much Asian representation, so Godzilla felt like it was my thing, if that makes sense. And I was drawn to any Godzilla movie. And I remember there was this guy down the street who I believe used to live in Japan and had these epic figures of all the kaiju. Godzilla, Rodan, Ghidorah, the whole crew. I was so jealous. Now, out of all the Godzilla films, Son of Godzilla is my favorite. So sue me. It's about scientists on a far-off island who stumble upon this weird egg that's messing with their scientific experiments. Lo and behold, it's baby Godzilla. But then there's other monsters on the island that want to eat this little guy. Thank goodness Daddy Godzilla swoops in to save his son and teaches him the ropes, including how to use his breath weapon. It's seriously adorable. And I totally admit I was teary-eyed at the end scene. Baby Godzilla shows up in a few more movies down the line, and every time he popped up, I was all over it. You know we have to include Barbarella, released in 1968, because it has to be in every sci-fi list of 60s movies. This movie is a trip. Critics gave it a 74 on the tomatometer, but the audience rating is a lukewarm 56. Based on a French comic book by Jean-Claude Forest, a very young Jane Fonda plays Barbarella, the space super agent sent on a mission to rescue, save, kidnap a scientist named Durand who's creating some sort of crazy super weapon. But hold on tight because Barbarella crash lands on Tau Ceti and dives into a wild series of adventures to find Duran. Sometimes you kind of forget there's even a plot because the whole thing is just so bizarre. The visuals, the storytelling, it's all way out there. And oh yeah, there's this underlying titillation of sex throughout the movie. I mean, someone tries to kill Barbarella with a machine that's supposed to orgasm her to death. Now, Barbarella herself was meant to be this symbol of a strong, modern woman unafraid of her sexuality. But with those outfits, I'll let you decide if that image holds up today. Still, it's become an iconic movie in the sci-fi world, a must-watch, even if just for the sheer experience of it all. It's time for The Time Machine, released in 1960. This movie is, of course, based on H.G. Wells' book. Critics gave it a 76 on the tomatometer, while the audience was even more into it with a score of 80. Now, if you're looking for a faithful adaptation of Wells' story, this one's probably as close as it gets. The original story follows a time traveler who zooms way ahead into the far, far future, fighting two new species, the Eloi and the Morlocks. But in Wells' version, neither group really looks human. The Eloi are more childlike in appearance. However, in the movie, they look like regular adult people, which kind of adds a different tone to the story. But there's no way you could represent Eloi as Wells imagined them back in the 60s, unless maybe it was an animation, or I guess they could have actually used children, but that probably would have ended up being really problematic since they decided to do a little love story. Anyway, what's cool about the movie is that it shows the time machine jumping through smaller time intervals, giving us a peek at the progression of wars that lead up to the ultimate war that divides humanity. Personally, I really love that. This movie still holds up, especially if you've read Wells' original story. It's a solid adaptation that stays true to the source material, or at least as true as was possible for the time. So if you're a fan of the book, The Time Machine, it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, next is The Day of the Triffids from 1963. Critics gave it a solid 78 on the tomatometer, but it seems like the audience wasn't as thrilled, only giving it a 51. Before we dive into the movie, can we just take a moment to appreciate John Wyndham? He's a British science fiction author from the 50s and 60s who wrote Day of the Triffids and other stories, and his writing is something special. I'm a big fan, and I know Lynette from my live streams is too. But here's the thing, he's kind of slipped under the radar. People just don't talk about John Wyndham much anymore. But seriously, do yourself a favor and check out his books. All right, back to Day of the Triffids. The story is about this meteor shower that lights up the sky and lures everyone in to watch. But the twist is anyone who looked up and saw the meteor shower goes blind the next day. Our main character was lucky, his name is Bill, and he was recovering from eye surgery, so he dodges that bullet. But hold on, these meteors also dropped some seeds that grew into something called Triffids, which are walking plants that chow down on people. The audience rating might be a bit low because, well, the special effects, I guess, haven't aged like fine wine. But hey, if that doesn't bother you, you're in for a treat with Day of the Triffids. It's a wild ride that'll definitely keep you on your toes. Let's talk about Seconds, which hit theaters back in 1966. Critics gave it a decent 79 on the tomatometer, but the audience seemed to love it even more, scoring it an 87. This movie's got that experimental, trippy vibe for the 60s, but it's also got this classic touch, especially with Rock Hudson as the lead. Rock Hudson! He plays a man named Arthur Hamilton, a banker in a midlife crisis feeling down and out about his life. Cue a shady company that promises to give him a fresh start, but the catch is it involves some major plastic surgery. But the surgery leaves him looking like Rock Hudson. Talk about a makeover. Now, Mr. Hamilton's got to ditch his old life, including his wife, and start anew as Tony Wilson, an artist living on the beach of Malibu. It's got this whole Twilight Zone vibe to it. Some critics have said it's a twist on the classic tale of Faust, plus it's in black and white, so it's got kind of a gloomy ambience. And it's directed by John Frankenheimer, who created movies like The Birdman of Alcatraz and The Manchurian Candidate. Actually, the style and tone is very similar to The Manchurian Candidate. Rock Hudson himself thought this was his best performance ever as an actor. If you're into extended Twilight Zone episodes, I bet you'll love Seconds. It's got that eerie and mind-bending feel that'll keep you hooked. You know, I'm a bit surprised by how high this next one ended up on the charts. Last Man on Earth sits at 81 on the tomatometer, but the audience score, which in my opinion makes more sense, is 69. It stars the horror maestro himself, Vincent Price. He's convinced he's the last human survivor after a global pandemic turns everyone else into zombie vampires. It's based on Richard Matheson's novel, I Am Legend, which got a couple of remakes later on, once in 1971 as The Omega Man with Charlton Heston, and again in 2007 with Will Smith in I Am Legend. But I think Last Man on Earth stays closest to the source material. Both the Heston and Smith versions don't quite have the guts to stick to the original ending. The whole legend in I Am Legend is about the legend of a monster, and it turns out our main character is the monster, not the zombie vampires. Now, the Will Smith version allegedly tried that ending, but it didn't score well with target audiences, so they changed it to the safe ending. Anyway, for the Vincent Price version, here's where it stumbles, in my opinion. Those zombie vampires, they are not scary at all. Vincent Price pretty much can just shove them away and they stumble back like it's a slapstick comedy. Plus the big climatic showdown at the end was kind of a letdown. But despite those flaws, I still think The Last Man on Earth is worth a watch. It's got its moments, but if you're curious about the original I Am Legend story, this one's probably the closest match you'll find. The Man with the X-Ray Eyes dropped back in 1963. Now it's got an 88 on the tomatometer, but has a lower audience score of 67. This is a Roger Corman movie, the director known for pumping out low-budget horror schlocks at lightning speed, like he made 5 or 6 movies a year. It's a simple yet, I think, well-executed story, and it's got Ray Milland in the lead. Can you believe Corman got Ray Milland in the title role? If you didn't know, Milland was a big deal leading actor back in the 40s, and he really carries this movie on his shoulders. The plot, Milland plays a scientist trying to amp up eyesight with a serum. Imagine if doctors had X-ray vision during surgery. That's the kind of thing he's working towards. But naturally, he experiments on himself and things start going south, kind of reminiscent of The Invisible Man. Eventually, he finds himself on the run from the police. And of course, we get these obligatory moments where you can see people without their clothes, but it's not presented in a sleazy way. He's more amused than anything else. After all, he's a doctor, so there's no big deal. There's even a scene with a colleague, a female doctor, and he notices her mole. And it's all done in an oddly lighthearted, nothing special kind of way. And of course, there's also the obligatory, how much money can I win gambling if I had X-ray vision scenario, which, spoiler alert, doesn't end very well. When he's on the lam, he lands a gig as a mind reader at this carnival. And guess who's the barker? None other than Don Rickles. Don Rickles, yes, the insult comedian, but here he's not playing for laughs. The movie doesn't lean heavily on special effects. The most striking thing are the contact lenses that make Milan's eyes look seriously creepy. Overall, it's a solid film. Maybe it's one of Corman's best. Considering that he's got over 50 films under his belt, the odds are a couple of them have to be good, right? And Man with the X-Ray Eyes is one of them. Definitely worth the watch. All right, let's dive into 5 Million Years to Earth, also known as Quartermass and the Pit, released in 1967. This one's got an 88 on the tomatometer and a 73 from the audience. Now, let me tell you, when I saw this movie as a kid, it scared the bejesus out of me. I'm talking full-blown nightmares. I couldn't shake it for days. Now, this movie is from Hammer Film Productions, which is kind of like Roger Corman's movies, but maybe with a little better reputation. Hammer Films was also known for its low-budget horror movies that it could crank out at a breakneck pace. This one is part of the Quartermass universe, which are stories based on a BBC science fiction serial featuring a scientist named Quartermass. But you don't really need to know any of that backstory or anything about the Quartermass oeuvre to really enjoy this movie. It stands strong on its own. The plot is about this weird object unearthed in London during an extension project for their subway system. At first, they think it's an old bomb from the Blitz, but hold the phone, it might be a spaceship. Because the confusing thing is that there are these ancient human remains around this object. So talk about a mystery. The tension in this movie is off the charts. Each layer that's peeled back in the story gets crazier and crazier. But don't expect mind-blowing special effects. I think here, though, for what they could do, they used what they had for maximum effect. I mean, there's this scene with grasshoppers that actually gave me nightmares. Even though it might look dated, the psychological game the film plays with your mind is intense. It's a slow burn, but the payoff is something else. If you're into eerie mysteries with a psychological edge, 5 Million Years to Earth, aka Quartermass in the Pit, is definitely worth a watch. Now we journey on The Fantastic Voyage, released in 1966. The movie scored a whopping 92 on the tomatometer, but an audience rating of only 68. Now, the whole idea of shrinking people isn't anything new, but the way they did it here, it was pretty darn unique. There's a scientist with a nasty blood clot in the brain. To fix him up, a team of scientists hop aboard a nuclear submarine that gets shrunk down to teeny tiny little itty bitty microscopic size. And then boom, they can be injected into the scientist's body to save the day. The movie stars Raquel Welch, and she was totally one of the star attractions. This was the peak of her career. And the novelization of the movie was written by none other than Isaac Asimov. One cool thing about this movie is how it kind of sneaks in some education while they're voyaging through the human body. When I first caught this film, I was just fascinated mostly by the special effects, but also by the journey through the body and doing things like fighting off white blood cells. It's one of those classic science fiction movies that you just know helped inspire other movies later on. So yeah, if you're up for a trip into the inner workings of the human body with some science fiction flair, Fantastic Voyage is the ticket. I am super pumped about the top movie, Village of the Damned, released in 1960. It's a black and white film that scored a stellar 93 on the tomatometer. That's more than 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it has a 77 audience score. And hey, guess what? This movie has something in common with Day of the Triffids. It's also adapted from a John Wyndham novel, this one called The Midwich Cuckoos. So, the story is seriously spooky. One day in this small town called Midwich, everyone mysteriously passes out for a few hours. The town is totally sealed off by this force field dome, so no one can get in or out. Then poof, the force field vanishes, everyone wakes up, and it's like, whoa, what just happened? But guess what? It's not over yet. After a period of time passes, it turns out that all the women of childbearing age in Midwich are now expecting a child, and guess what's even weirder? They all give birth at the same time, delivering these kids with ghostly blonde hair and eerie eyes. It is really creepy. This movie also got George Sanders for the lead, and he's a fantastic actor. He played Addison DeWitt in All About Eve. It's the epitome of a mind-bending sci-fi film that gets under your skin like no other. If you're into thought-provoking movies that give you the chills, Village of the Damned is where it's at. So those are my top 10 lesser-known science fiction movies from the 60s, all ranked by Rotten Tomatoes. Have you seen any of these movies? Would you have swapped some out with other movies? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit the button to subscribe to my channel. And if you've got any other list ideas for speculative movies, let me know down in the comments. Until we meet again, may all the movies you watch and books you read be